Library dust floated through the filtered sunlight as David Reed flipped through another puzzle book. Around him, students from dozens of different worlds whispered nervously about tomorrow's mind maze test. The arachnoid at the next table had been shaking for 3 hours straight, all 6 of her arms trembling as she tried to read the same meditation manual over and over again. David found it hard to concentrate on his crossword with all the panicking going on. He understood why everyone was so worked up, but honestly, it seemed like they were making things way more complicated than they needed to be. The mind maze test was supposed to be this incredibly difficult mental challenge that broke most people who tried it. Only about 1 in 4 students passed, and those who failed often ended up in therapy for months afterward. But when David read the test description, it sounded like any other standardized exam to him. Sure, it involved some kind of psychic maze that tried to mess with your head, but at the end of the day it was still just a bunch of puzzles that needed solving. He had been doing puzzles his entire life. His grandmother used to give him word games when he was 5 years old. His father built mechanical puzzle boxes in the garage. David had won his high school's puzzle tournament 3 years running. The crystalline student across from him made a sound like breaking glass. That was Zara, and she had been trying to achieve some kind of mental harmony for weeks now. Her people, the resonants, apparently needed to align their consciousness with cosmic frequencies or something equally mystical before they could handle the test's mental pressure. David thought that sounded exhausting. He looked back at his puzzle book and filled in another word. 7 letters, starts with P. Clue was persistence in spite of obstacles. The answer was obvious. Persist. David had always been good at seeing the simple solutions that other people missed. His study group had tried to convince him to take the test more seriously. Kevik, the arachnoid, had shown him meditation techniques that her species used to prepare their multiple brains for synchronized thinking. The process involved sitting perfectly still for hours while thinking about mathematical concepts. David had lasted about 10 minutes before getting bored and suggesting they just work through some practice problems instead. That had horrified everyone. Practice problems were apparently missing the point entirely. The mind maze test was not about solving puzzles, they insisted. It was about proving that your mind could withstand psychological torture while maintaining rational thought. It was about demonstrating mental evolution beyond your species' normal limitations. It was about spiritual transcendence and cognitive metamorphosis. David nodded politely during these explanations, but privately he thought his classmates were overthinking things. Every description of the test made it sound like a really elaborate escape room with some added stress. He had done escape rooms back on Earth. They were fun. The trick was to stay calm and work through the clues systematically, instead of running around in circles. The Academy's records showed that the test had been used for over 800 years to identify students capable of handling advanced mental disciplines. Most species spent generations developing preparation techniques. Some cultures built entire religious practices around getting ready for the mind maze. There were meditation schools that existed solely to train potential test takers. All of this seemed like massive overkill to David. He had read about the test's creator, an ancient being called the Examiner, who designed the maze to push minds beyond their normal limits. The psychological pressure was supposed to be overwhelming, creating fear and confusion that made logical thinking nearly impossible. Only students who could maintain mental clarity under extreme duress were considered qualified for the Academy's most prestigious programs. But humans had evolved on Earth, where mental clarity under duress was basically a survival requirement. Ice ages, predators, natural disasters, wars, plagues. David's ancestors had dealt with every possible kind of stress while still managing to invent agriculture, build cities, and eventually reach the stars. A test designed to create artificial stress did not seem particularly intimidating compared to the millions of years of genuine life-or-death situations that had shaped human psychology. David closed his puzzle book and looked around the library again. Students were still whispering about meditation techniques and mental fortification exercises. Some had been fasting for days to purify their thoughts. Others were taking specialized drugs to enhance their neural pathways. A few were performing complex rituals that were supposed to prepare their souls for the maze's spiritual challenges. He felt a little sorry for them, honestly. They were working so hard to get ready for something that was basically just a complicated test. David remembered feeling similarly overwhelmed before his college entrance exams, but once he actually sat down and started working through the questions, they turned out to be much more manageable than expected. The anticipation was always worse than the reality. His human classmates back on Earth would probably find this whole situation ridiculous. They dealt with standardized tests by studying the material, getting a good night's sleep, and eating a decent breakfast. No meditation, no fasting, no spiritual preparation required, just practical preparation and common sense. David gathered his books and headed back to his dormitory. Tomorrow he would take the mind maze test, and he was planning to approach it the same way he approached any other challenge. Stay calm, think logically, and work through the problems one at a time. If it really was just a bunch of puzzles with some added psychological pressure, then his years of puzzle-solving experience should be more than adequate preparation. He passed Kevik in the hallway. She was still clutching her meditation manual, all 6 eyes wide with anxiety. David gave her an encouraging nod, but she just chittered nervously and hurried past. Poor thing had been studying preparation techniques for months, learning mental exercises that were supposed to help her species coordinate their multiple brains under stress. Back in his room, David ordered a pizza and pulled up some old comedy shows on his tablet. Relaxation was his preferred pre-test strategy. Tomorrow would be challenging, sure, but it would also be interesting. He was actually looking forward to seeing what kinds of puzzles the famous mind maze contained. It had been a while since he had encountered a really good mental challenge. His phone buzzed with worried messages from other students, all sharing last-minute preparation tips and anxiety management techniques. David typed back some reassuring responses, but he did not share their sense of impending doom. The test was tomorrow, and then it would be over. Simple as that. He settled back to watch his shows and get a good night's rest before the big day. Steam rose from David's breakfast as he sat in the academy cafeteria, watching his fellow students pick at their food with obvious nervousness. Most of them looked like they had not slept at all. Kevik was methodically arranging her utensils in perfect geometric patterns, a stress behavior common to her species. Zara had not touched her energy crystals at all, and was making that glass-breaking sound again every few minutes. David finished his eggs and toast while reading the sports section of yesterday's news feed. The testing would begin in 2 hours, and he figured a normal breakfast was better preparation than whatever complicated dietary rituals his classmates were following. Several students had been fasting for days, convinced that empty stomachs would help them achieve mental purity. That seemed counterproductive to David. His brain worked better when it had fuel. The testing facility looked like a cross between a medical center and some kind of ancient temple. 17 specialized chairs were arranged in a circle around a central platform where the examiner would monitor the proceedings. Each chair was designed for different alien physiologies. Some had extra limbs, others needed specific atmospheric conditions, and a few required direct neural plugs that made David grateful for his relatively simple human biology. The examiner entered the chamber as the students took their positions. The ancient being moved with fluid grace that suggested vast experience and equally vast age. Its form was vaguely humanoid but clearly evolved far beyond any physical limitations. When it spoke, the words appeared directly in each student's mind rather than being heard through ears. The test would connect all 17 students to a shared mental construct called the mind maze. Each would experience the labyrinth individually, but their mental signatures would be visible to the others through the psychic link. This was supposed to add an additional layer of pressure, as students could sense each other's panic and failure in real time. David settled into his chair and allowed the technicians to attach the neural monitoring equipment. The process was surprisingly comfortable. Just a few sensors on his temples and a lightweight headset that would facilitate the mental connection. He had expected something more dramatic given all the buildup. The synchronization process began with a gentle tingling sensation as the machinery established contact with his nervous system. Around him, other students were already showing signs of distress as their minds were pulled into the construct. David felt the familiar disorientation of virtual reality systems, but nothing particularly alarming. Then, the world disappeared. David found himself standing in a vast corridor made of what looked like living metal. The walls pulsed with soft, bioluminescent patterns that shifted and changed as he watched. The air felt thick and oppressive, charged with some kind of energy that was supposed to make thinking difficult. He could sense the presence of his fellow students somewhere in the maze, their mental signatures broadcasting various levels of panic and confusion. But David felt surprisingly normal. The psychological pressure that was supposed to be overwhelming registered as roughly equivalent to the stress he used to feel during final exams. Unpleasant, but manageable. The maze was clearly designed to induce fear and panic, but his human brain seemed to treat it as just another unusual environment that required adaptation. He began walking forward, examining the corridor's construction, with genuine curiosity. The walls were covered with symbols and patterns that shifted when he looked directly at them. This was probably the first puzzle element, some kind of code or navigation system hidden in the visual noise. David had seen similar tricks in puzzle games back home. Through the psychic link, he could feel Kevik's distress intensifying. Her multiple brains were apparently having trouble coordinating under the maze's influence, creating a feedback loop of confusion that made logical thinking nearly impossible. Zara's crystalline thought patterns were fragmenting as the chaotic mental energies interfered with her species' natural harmonic resonance. David paused to consider this problem. The maze was clearly designed to exploit each species' particular vulnerabilities. For the arachnoids, it created cognitive dissonance between their multiple brain centers. For the resonants, it generated mental static that disrupted their harmonic thinking. For most species, it probably targeted whatever psychological weaknesses had developed during their evolutionary history. But humans had evolved on Earth, where psychological resilience was a matter of survival. David's ancestors had dealt with predators, natural disasters, and social competition while maintaining rational thought under extreme stress. The maze's artificial pressure felt significant, but not overwhelming, compared to the genuine life-or-death situations that had shaped human psychology. He continued exploring, treating each branching passage like a decision point in a logic puzzle. The maze was trying to create confusion by presenting too many choices at once, but David simply applied the same systematic approach he used for any complex problem. Rule out obviously wrong options, look for patterns in the remaining choices, and proceed methodically rather than rushing toward quick solutions. The first major puzzle appeared after about 10 minutes of walking. The corridor opened into a large chamber filled with floating geometric shapes that rearranged themselves based on his movements. Other students would probably see this as some kind of mystical challenge requiring deep meditation and spiritual insight. David recognized it as a three-dimensional matching game, similar to puzzles he had played on his computer. He spent a few minutes observing the shape's movement patterns, then began manipulating them with careful precision. The key was to think in terms of spatial relationships rather than getting distracted by the shape's shifting colors and textures. Within minutes, he had arranged them into the correct configuration and unlocked the passage to the next section. Through the mental link, David could sense his fellow students' amazement. Several of them had been struggling with the same puzzle for much longer, their minds clouded by the maze's psychological warfare. His calm, methodical approach was completely foreign to their experience of the test as a traumatic ordeal. He continued, deeper into the labyrinth, encountering increasingly complex challenges. Each section tested different cognitive abilities: memory, pattern recognition, creative problem-solving, and logical deduction. But they all followed the same basic principle: ignore the scary presentation and focus on the underlying puzzle mechanics. David found himself actually enjoying the experience. The mind maze was genuinely challenging, requiring him to use skills he had developed over years of recreational puzzle solving. But it was also fair. Every puzzle had a logical solution that could be reached through careful analysis. The psychological pressure was just window dressing designed to prevent students from thinking clearly. His steady progress was having an unexpected effect on the other test takers. Several students who had been on the verge of complete breakdown began stabilizing as they sensed his calm confidence through the psychic link. His mental signature, radiating curiosity and mild satisfaction rather than terror and desperation, provided them with a different framework for understanding their experience. David reached another decision point and paused to consider his options. The maze was definitely getting more complex, but the underlying principles remained the same. Stay calm, think logically, and work through the problems one step at a time. Just like any other puzzle, really. Rain drummed against the academy's windows 3 floors above the testing chamber, but David could not hear it from inside the mind maze. He had been navigating the mental labyrinth for over an hour now, and what had started as individual puzzle chambers was evolving into something much more sophisticated. The deeper sections were connected in ways that reminded him of his favorite crossword tournaments back home. Each solved area provided clues for the next challenge. David paused at an intersection where 5 corridors branched off in different directions. Instead of choosing randomly like most students would, he had learned to map the maze's overall structure in his mind. The psychological pressure was still there, trying to cloud his judgment with artificial anxiety and confusion. But his human brain seemed naturally resistant to the effect. Where other species experienced crushing dread, he felt roughly the same mild stress as a difficult Monday morning at his old job. Through the psychic link, he could sense his classmates' continued deterioration. 3 resonants had already withdrawn from the test, their crystalline thought matrices completely shattered by the conflicting mental frequencies. Kevik was still hanging on, but her usually precise analytical thinking had devolved into frantic chittering as her multiple brains fought against each other instead of working together. The maze's designers had clearly spent centuries studying different species' psychological vulnerabilities. For each alien mindset, there were specific triggers designed to exploit evolutionary fears and cognitive blind spots. But humans had evolved as persistence hunters and social problem solvers on a world full of constant threats. David's ancestors had survived ice ages, predators, plagues, and wars by maintaining rational thought under extreme stress. A test designed to create artificial psychological pressure simply did not register as particularly threatening. David chose the leftmost corridor and immediately encountered a new type of challenge. The walls were covered with shifting patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the floor kept changing texture under his feet. This section was clearly designed to overload sensory processing and create disorientation. But David had spent years playing video games that used similar disorientation techniques. So he knew the trick was to focus on one element at a time rather than trying to process everything simultaneously. He closed his eyes and felt along the wall with one hand, ignoring the visual chaos completely. The surface contained raised symbols that formed a sequence, not random decoration but another puzzle element. By touch alone, he mapped out a pattern that corresponded to a navigation code. The maze was testing whether students could maintain focus despite sensory overload, a skill that humans had developed during millions of years of hunting in complex environments. Within minutes, David had decoded the wall symbols and identified the correct path forward. Around him, he could sense other students still struggling with the visual assault, their minds overwhelmed by stimuli they had never learned to filter effectively. His matter-of-fact progress through challenges that were breaking trained scholars was starting to attract attention from the examiner. Through the monitoring systems, the ancient being observed David's brain patterns with growing fascination. In 3 centuries of administering the mind maze test, the examiner had never encountered a mind that treated the labyrinth's psychological warfare as merely background noise. David's neural activity showed curiosity and mild frustration, emotions appropriate for solving a challenging puzzle, rather than the terror and desperation that characterized normal test responses. The next section presented David with what appeared to be an impossible room. The geometry was wrong in ways that should have induced vertigo and mental breakdown. Walls curved in directions that violated 3-dimensional space, and staircases led to platforms that could not physically exist. Previous test takers had described this area as a reality-defying nightmare that drove viewers to madness. David looked around the space and tilted his head thoughtfully. The impossible geometry was actually just a matter of thinking in higher dimensions, a concept he had studied during his theoretical physics courses back on Earth. The room was not truly impossible. It was simply constructed according to mathematical principles that most species found counterintuitive. Once he stopped trying to visualize it in conventional three-dimensional terms, the navigation became straightforward. He began moving through the space with casual confidence, treating the supposedly mind-breaking architecture like an interesting engineering problem. The staircases that seemed to lead nowhere actually connected to passages hidden in dimensional folds. The walls that appeared to curve impossibly were simply following non-Euclidean geometry. David had encountered similar concepts in puzzle games that played with spatial relationships. His casual navigation of the impossible room sent shockwaves through his fellow students. Several who had been trapped in earlier sections for over an hour suddenly began making progress, inspired by his demonstration that the maze's challenges were solvable rather than mystical ordeals requiring spiritual transcendence. David reached a chamber filled with floating equation fragments that rearranged themselves based on his mental state. This was clearly a mathematics puzzle, but one designed to become more difficult as the solver became stressed or frustrated. The maze was trying to create a feedback loop where increasing difficulty led to increasing panic, which led to even greater difficulty. But David approached the mathematical challenge the same way he approached every other puzzle in the maze. He ignored the psychological manipulation and focused on the underlying logic. The equation fragments were components of a larger mathematical proof, and the trick was to arrange them in the correct sequence without getting distracted by their shifting positions and changing colors. His years of puzzle-solving experience had taught him to recognize when a challenge was trying to misdirect his attention. The visual effects and psychological pressure were just noise designed to hide the actual problem. By maintaining emotional equilibrium and systematic thinking, he could solve the mathematics puzzle in minutes rather than hours. Through the psychic link, David began unconsciously sharing his problem-solving approach with the other students. His running mental commentary, noting that one section was similar to puzzles from his childhood, or that another challenge was basically a matching game with fancy graphics, provided his classmates with completely different frameworks for understanding the maze's obstacles. Several students who had seemed destined for complete mental breakdown suddenly began stabilizing as they adopted elements of David's "it's just a puzzle" mindset. The test's psychological manipulation lost some of its power when viewed through the lens of human pragmatism rather than spiritual trial or evolutionary challenge. David progressed through increasingly complex sections, each one building on solutions from previous areas. The maze was revealing itself as a masterpiece of interconnected puzzle design, but one that could be solved through patience, systematic thinking, and refusal to be intimidated by presentation. His casual approach to challenges that had terrified students for centuries was beginning to suggest that the mind maze test measured conditioning and cultural preconceptions rather than actual cognitive ability. He could sense the examiner's growing confusion as the ancient being watched him treat their most prestigious examination like an entertaining diversion. David's success was not just solving the maze, it was revealing fundamental flaws in the entire testing philosophy that had guided galactic education for hundreds of years. Silence filled the Academy's observation deck as faculty members watched the test monitors in disbelief. David had reached the maze's central chamber faster than any student in recorded history, and his brain patterns showed none of the expected signs of mental strain. Where previous test takers had arrived at the core challenge exhausted and psychologically damaged, the human appeared refreshed and genuinely curious about what came next. The central chamber was a vast spherical space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. At its heart floated the final construct, a massive three-dimensional puzzle that shifted and morphed based on the viewer's mental state. The Academy's records described it as an impossible geometric nightmare that drove most students to complete madness simply by looking at it. Those few who managed to solve it usually required months of psychological recovery afterward. David studied the floating construct with the same analytical interest he might show for a particularly challenging jigsaw puzzle. The geometry was certainly complex, with surfaces that folded through dimensions his eyes could not quite follow, but the underlying structure reminded him of the mechanical puzzle boxes his father used to build in their garage. Those had seemed impossible at first glance too, until you learned to think about them systematically. The construct responded to his calm observation by becoming slightly more stable, its chaotic transformations settling into recognizable patterns. David realized this was the test's core mechanism. The final challenge adapted to each student's psychological state, becoming more difficult and threatening as they became more stressed and frightened. For minds approaching in terror and desperation, it would appear as an incomprehensible horror that defied rational analysis. But David's emotional equilibrium was causing it to reveal its true nature as an elaborate but ultimately solvable three-dimensional puzzle. The impossible geometry was simply a matter of thinking in higher dimensions, something he had studied in his theoretical physics courses. The reality-defying transformations followed mathematical principles that were complex but not actually supernatural. He began manipulating sections of the construct with patient experimentation, treating each component like a piece of an intricate mechanical toy. Parts that seemed to lead nowhere actually connected to hidden segments accessible through dimensional rotation. Surfaces that appeared solid could be passed through once you understood their geometric properties. The whole thing was beautifully designed, really. A masterpiece of mathematical engineering disguised as cosmic horror. Through the psychic link, other students began arriving at the central chamber in various states of mental exhaustion. Kevik stumbled in with all 6 of her limbs shaking, her multiple brains barely coordinated enough to maintain basic locomotion. Zara materialized as a flickering, barely stable crystalline form, her thought patterns fractured but still functional. Several others had not made it this far at all. They watched in amazement as David continued working on the construct with casual confidence. Where they saw a mind-breaking abomination that violated the laws of physics, he apparently saw an entertaining challenge. His running commentary was equally bewildering. He compared sections of the construct to toys from his childhood and noted similarities to puzzles he had solved for fun. David paused in his work to explain his approach to the other students. The key was to ignore the scary visual effects and focus on the underlying mechanical principles. Each transformation followed logical rules, and once you mapped out those rules, the solution became obvious. The construct was not trying to drive them insane. It was testing their ability to maintain rational thought while being presented with unfamiliar concepts. His matter-of-fact explanation provided the struggling students with a completely different framework for understanding their situation. Instead of viewing the test as a mystical trial that required spiritual transcendence, they could treat it as David did, a complex but solvable engineering problem. Several students who had been on the verge of complete breakdown suddenly began making progress as they adopted his practical mindset. Through the monitoring systems, the examiner observed this development with profound confusion. The mind maze test had been carefully designed over centuries to evaluate students' ability to transcend their species' normal psychological limitations. It was supposed to identify minds capable of operating beyond conventional thought patterns, pushing through barriers that would stop ordinary individuals. But David was demonstrating that the test's fundamental premise was flawed. He was not transcending human psychology. He was applying it. His species had evolved to find patterns in chaos and maintain functionality under stress. The maze's psychological warfare was simply ineffective against minds shaped by millions of years of survival on a hostile world. More disturbing was the effect David's presence was having on the other students. His calm confidence was providing them with tools to overcome conditioning that had seemed insurmountable. The test's psychological manipulation was losing its power when viewed through his pragmatic perspective. Students who should have failed were succeeding simply by adopting his "it's just a puzzle" approach. David made a final adjustment to the central construct and stepped back as it settled into a stable configuration. The solution had taken him about 20 minutes of focused work, roughly the same amount of time he typically spent on difficult crossword puzzles. The supposedly mind-breaking challenge had turned out to be complex but entirely manageable. Once you ignored the intimidating presentation, the other students stared at the solved construct in stunned silence. Several of them had prepared for this test their entire lives, spending years learning meditation techniques and mental fortification exercises passed down through generations. They had approached it as the ultimate trial of intellectual and spiritual development. David had treated it like a recreational activity and solved it faster than anyone in academy history. The examiner's ancient mind struggled to process what had occurred. David had not just completed the mind maze test, he had revealed it as an arbitrary barrier rather than a meaningful measure of cognitive ability. His success demonstrated that the test evaluated cultural conditioning and species-specific vulnerabilities rather than actual mental capacity. The implications were staggering. For centuries, the Academy had used the mind maze to maintain educational hierarchies based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about consciousness and cognitive development. David's performance suggested that many qualified students had been excluded, not because they lacked ability, but because their species had not evolved the particular type of psychological resilience that the test demanded. As the other students began working through the now stable construct using David's techniques, it became clear that the test's difficulty was largely artificial. The challenges were genuinely complex, but they became manageable once students stopped being intimidated by their presentation. David's greatest contribution was not superior intelligence, it was his refusal to accept that the problems were unsolvable. Emergency meetings erupted across the Academy's administrative levels as news of David's performance spread through the faculty. The human had not only completed the mind maze test in record time, but his approach had enabled half a dozen other students to succeed where they should have failed catastrophically. The test's fundamental assumptions about cognitive evaluation were collapsing under scrutiny that no one had thought to apply before. David sat in the post-test debriefing room, answering questions from increasingly bewildered academic officials. He kept trying to explain that the maze had not been particularly difficult once you understood its basic principles, but this only seemed to confuse his questioners further. They appeared convinced that he must have used some advanced human mental technique that transcended normal cognitive processes. The truth was simpler and more revolutionary than they realized. David had succeeded by refusing to be intimidated by the test's psychological manipulation. His human brain, shaped by evolutionary pressures that demanded rational thinking under extreme stress, simply did not respond to artificial fear induction the way other species did. What the test designers had intended as overwhelming psychic pressure registered to him as minor background annoyance. But the Academy's administrators were struggling to accept this explanation. The mind maze test represented 8 centuries of educational tradition and theoretical development. Admitting that a student could solve it by treating it like a recreational puzzle would invalidate the entire philosophical framework underlying their most prestigious programs. The examiner entered the debriefing room and studied David with ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. The being's mental voice carried undertones of confusion and something that might have been admiration. Never before had a test subject approached the maze with such casual confidence, and never before had the psychological warfare component proven so completely ineffective. David found himself explaining his problem-solving approach for the dozenth time. The maze had presented complex challenges, certainly, but they all followed logical principles that could be understood through systematic analysis. The scary visual effects and psychological pressure were just window dressing designed to prevent clear thinking. Once you ignored the intimidation tactics and focused on the underlying puzzles, the solutions became obvious. This explanation sent shockwaves through the assembled faculty members. If David was correct, then the mind maze test was not measuring cognitive transcendence or spiritual evolution. It was simply evaluating each species' resistance to artificial psychological manipulation. Students were failing not because they lacked mental capacity, but because their evolutionary backgrounds had not prepared them for the specific type of stress the test created. The implications extended far beyond a single examination. The Academy's entire hierarchical structure was based on the assumption that different species had fundamentally different cognitive potentials. The mind maze test had been used to justify educational policies that channeled students into programs based on their species' supposed mental limitations. David's success suggested that these limitations were largely cultural rather than biological. News of the testing crisis reached other students within hours. The Academy's communication networks buzzed with speculation and debate as word spread that a human had essentially broken their most feared examination. Some students felt betrayed, having spent years preparing for a test that apparently could be solved through simple puzzle-solving techniques. Others were inspired by the possibility that barriers they had accepted as insurmountable might actually be conquerable. Kevik found David in the common area later that evening, all 6 of her eyes bright with excitement. She had successfully completed the mind maze test using techniques derived from his approach, becoming the first arachnoid in her family's history to pass the examination. Her people's traditional preparation methods had actually been counterproductive, creating the very cognitive dissonance that the test exploited. Zara approached more hesitantly, her crystalline form still flickering from the day's stress. She had also passed, though barely, after adopting David's suggestion to treat the maze's chaotic energies as background noise rather than meaningful input. Her species' emphasis on harmonic thinking had made them vulnerable to the test's deliberate discord. But David's pragmatic approach had provided an alternative framework. The Academy faced an immediate crisis of legitimacy. If the mind maze test could be solved through basic puzzle-solving skills rather than species-specific transcendence, then centuries of educational theory needed revision. More practically, they had to decide what to do with the current crop of test results. David's performance had enabled several students to succeed who should have failed according to traditional expectations. Emergency committees formed to review the testing protocols and consider fundamental changes to the Academy's evaluation methods. David found himself at the center of debates about cognitive diversity, cultural bias in academic assessment, and the nature of intelligence itself. His casual dismissal of their most prestigious examination had inadvertently triggered a revolution in galactic educational philosophy. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. The examiner, after reviewing centuries of test data through the lens of David's insights, announced that the mind maze test would be completely redesigned. Instead of using psychological manipulation to evaluate mental resilience, the new version would focus on actual problem-solving abilities across multiple cognitive domains. David's approach had revealed that different species brought valuable perspectives to complex challenges, but the old test format had been too narrow to recognize this diversity. A human's pattern recognition skills, an arachnoid's multi-threaded analysis, and a resonance harmonic intuition were all legitimate cognitive strengths that deserved recognition and development. Within months, the Academy's reform movement had spread to other educational institutions across the galaxy. David's success became a case study in cross-species cognitive diversity, demonstrating that the most profound solutions often came from questioning basic assumptions rather than accepting established limitations. The human found himself somewhat overwhelmed by his newfound fame as an educational revolutionary. He had simply approached a difficult test the same way he approached any puzzle, with curiosity rather than fear, and systematic thinking rather than panic. The fact that this had triggered fundamental changes in galactic education policy seemed like massive overkill for what should have been a routine academic exercise. But David was beginning to understand that his species brought a unique perspective to the broader galaxy. Humans had evolved as generalist problem solvers who refused to accept that challenges were impossible. This mindset, so natural to him that he barely noticed it, was apparently rare enough to reshape entire educational systems when applied thoughtfully. His academic career became legendary not for intellectual superiority, but for the distinctly human ability to look at any obstacle and think, let's see how this works, instead of, this cannot be done. His legacy transformed galactic education by proving that the most insurmountable barriers often crumbled when approached with curiosity rather than reverence, and with practical determination rather than mystical preparation.